Back in December, Leeds United were playing Cardiff City at home in the Championship. A win would put them top of the table, 12 points clear of third place.
It's a chance for a break from Leeds here. They've got bodies up quickly, and the ball is played out quickly towards Helder Costa, and Helder Costa's in the penalty area. Oh yes! What a start to the game for Leeds United.
Going 3-0 up early in the second half, and all seemed well. But then disaster struck.
Cardiff have it far side, and Tomlin with a flick up towards the edge of the penalty area, and there's a chance for the goal. It's an equaliser. Cardiff have pulled it back, and Glatzel it was who stole in behind the Leeds back line.
This started a slump in form that saw Leeds fritter away points. Before long, they were caught up by the chasing pack.
Forest are within a point of Leeds United, and the 11-point buffer zone has gone for sure now for Leeds United. They have been caught by the pack.
Fast forward to today, and Leeds find themselves a point off the top of the table with a 5-point buffer from Fulham in third place and a much easier run of fixtures on paper than their rivals.
Click, Harrison, they're both up there with him. Click's touch, and then there's the third, Tyler Roberts. The Leeds United machine is rolling again. Destination Premier League.
In this episode, we ask, could this be the season where Leeds finally do it? And what will the next 3 months mean in the context of Marcelo Bielsa's career?
We went through a sequence of some pretty tetchy and spiky press conferences with him where he was clearly aware that public opinion was starting to turn because of the results.
Phil Hay covers Leeds United for The Athletic.
He felt that from us in the media he was getting a lot of loaded questions or questions that were implying criticism of his decisions or of his tactics. He was finding it very difficult not to bite on what was being asked. And the press conference that stands out in particular, the 59-minute one, where he complained about the coverage of the end of Nketiah's loan. He clearly feels aggrieved about the way that's been portrayed, and several other things as well. The message from it was very much that he wasn't going to back down and he wasn't for turning, and that he would continue doing what he'd been doing for 18 months. The tactics weren't going to change, his selection of players weren't going to change. There was criticism of Casilla and Bamford, but if anything, it seemed to solidify his thinking and to make him more and more resistant to the idea of dropping either player. You have to say now, a few weeks on, that it has turned around without him changing anything significantly on the pitch. He's made very little in the way of personnel changes, very little in the way of tactical changes. But suddenly, since that defeat at Forest, when it did feel as if things were very much on the verge of dropping to bits, it has turned on its head by simply sticking to the formula. And it's 13 points from 15. It's Leeds now back in control very much of second position and actually right on the tail of West Brom as well. It feels like a completely different environment to how it was after Forest. And it's fascinating again to see that, as he always does, Bielsa, he's done that with pure coaching and simply by sticking to what he thinks is the right way to play.
So do you think the slump is well and truly over now?
It feels like it is, and I think it's been helped by other clubs in the division going through little wobbles of their own. I mean, Fulham, at the point where they moved level on points with Leeds, had Leeds exactly where they wanted them and had them on the hook, and they very much let them off the hook with a period of poor results and a passage of results which have required last-minute winner against Swansea City, have required them to hang in that sense, to stay within 5 points of Leeds, let alone to be level with them. Brentford have dropped off just at the point where they looked like they might be getting it together, and as we felt right up until the slump got serious, it's hard to see where the challenge is coming from below Leeds. I'm not sure who it is that's going to put together enough results in the last 10 games of the season to get beyond them or to get beyond West Brom. I think the top two have got a very strong hand at the moment.
What, in your opinion, caused the slump?
Bielsa always argues, and people at the club tell me this is true, that the physical output data doesn't differ from the periods where Leeds are playing well and getting good results to the periods where they aren't playing so well and are dropping points. But I think what you can't quantify and what you don't really have any statistical analysis for is the mental aspect of it. And I do think that from time to time there will be mental fatigue with players in the squad. That there will be times where the stress and strain of a regime which is very, very exacting, and which, the strict rules on diet and weight and everything else does catch up with them and probably does get into their heads, particularly at the point where results start to turn. That was the nature of the beast in January. The results weren't good. And I always go back to the interview that Luke Ayling had after the defeat at Nottingham Forest in early February. He looked very downbeat and he said, we play good football but only to a point. We don't score enough goals. We keep conceding the first goal, and the first goal killed us, and it was another error from Kiko Castillo.
Now Forest come with Amiobi finding space into the penalty area. Low drive from Amiobi. And as simple as that, Leeds United find themselves behind, failed to clear the ball, and Amiobi has punished Leeds.
There was almost implied criticism there from Ayling of Casilla, of the setup, of the tactics, the fact that it wasn't working. And I do think that that's the point at which it must become harder for players to stick with it with Bielsa, because for as long as it's going well, the demands of the regime are worth taking and are worth adhering to. But when it starts to go wrong, or when it feels like it's starting to go wrong, it must be far more difficult to apply yourself in the same way, and more difficult to have faith that actually it is going to work.
You've had the benefit of almost 2 seasons of following Bielsa around, and I think by the end of this season he will have managed more games at Leeds than he has anywhere else except Athletic, which is quite impressive considering his career. I just wondered if you had a take on the Bielsa burnout narrative that's obviously bandied around a lot, particularly in light of the fact that this current blip seems to have happened mid-season rather than at the end, but seems to have all of the same characteristics as a Bielsa burnout. So I wondered if you had any thoughts on why that might be the case.
As I say, I don't think physically it's a massive issue, although I'd look again at the size of the squad, which is minuscule in comparison to a lot. And someone was saying to me a few weeks back, there are literally 14, 15 players who've played more than 5 games this season, and you have a lot who are ever present or virtually ever present, like Ben White and Clake and Phillips and Cooper, guys who have been pushed right from the start and have never had any form of break at all, with the exception of Phillips, who of course had that 3-match ban for his red card. I know Bielsa said he didn't feel that had made a positive difference to Phillips, but it looked to all of us with the naked eye like he was fresher, and it had helped just for him to get a little bit of a breather. Mentally, it is demanding. The players don't get a lot of time off. They don't get a lot of respite from the training schedule. And I think that is probably the greatest risk to Bielsa, is that mentally the players struggle at key points when he really needs them to perform. And it's hard not to draw that conclusion last season when, against Wigan, they were pretty much in position to really, really strengthen the hold on second place and lost in the most baffling circumstances. And again, against Derby, it felt like it was in their heads. It felt like Leeds were fighting something in their own heads as opposed to fighting Derby County in that playoff semi-final. And that, I think, is where the strain comes, and probably far more of an impact there than there is physically. It is demanding physically, but the way the players are prepared and the way they're conditioned, they are actually able to cope with it pretty well, which is why when you see new signings coming in like Augustine and last season your Izzy Browns and so on, Jamal Blackman, it's difficult for them to get up to Bielsa's level and to his standards, particularly when they join mid-season, because he is so exacting and he is so strict about making sure that those standards are met. So the players are in good enough physical condition to cope, but I think you'd be naive not to think that from time to time, mentally, it asks a lot of them, and at times it probably asks more of them than they can deliver.
I don't know if you've heard about the Peter principle. It's a principle that's used in management, in which the idea is that you promote people to a point where they're incompetent. And I've heard a few people this season suggesting a similar thing has happened at Leeds. Obviously, there's a squad there who were finishing largely in 13th place, and now they're challenging for promotion. And the suggestion is, I think, that these players aren't used to being under the pressure of that kind of situation. Would you agree with that sort of assessment? Do you think there's something of that going on?
The only way in which I could see the Peter principle being applied to this squad is that so few of them have experience of winning promotion to the Premier League, and not a huge number of them have experience of winning major trophies, or certainly not regularly. You do have some. You have Clake, who won the Dutch Cup in Holland several years ago. You have Casilla, who obviously was involved with Real Madrid, although very much in a peripheral role and on the bench. And obviously you've got the likes of Bamford, who has been involved in promotion campaigns before, went very close with Middlesbrough back when he was Player of the Year. But I don't think there's any doubt about that that there is a shortage in the squad of experience of actually getting over the line. And Bielsa himself isn't awash with trophies. You know, his career hasn't delivered too many, and he says regularly that you know, one of the criticisms of him is that he hasn't delivered silverware. You know, for all that Guardiola and Simeone and Pochettino speak highly of him, and you know, he's always very, very modest about that praise. He says, people don't think I win enough trophies, and he's probably right. Although I still go back to the fact that the clubs he takes on are very rarely in a position to win a huge number of trophies, and I think the same can be said for Leeds. The squad he's taken on were at best outside contenders for the playoffs under Christensen and Heckingbottom, but if we're being brutally honest, we're mid-table and no better than that. And he hasn't made a huge amount of change to that squad. He has elevated them all, and I don't think that Peter principle will be an issue this season. I'm not even sure it was an issue last season. I'm not sure that it would necessarily have made a huge difference had you had players in there that had crossed the line previously. I just think everybody got tense at the last minute. And I think there's the added factor of being at Leeds United where, as I always say, you've got 15 years of not winning promotion, 15 years of being stuck outside the Premier League. And like it or not, that is a huge cross to bear.
Yeah, it's interesting because it seems as though there's such a vast cavern between Leeds playing well and Leeds playing badly, and there doesn't seem to become much in between those two things. I wondered if you had any sort of thoughts on why that might be the case.
I think because they don't alter their approach depending on how the game is going. You would never see, a couple of exceptions, you would never see Bielsa shift to two up front. You know, I remember him doing it at Fulham before Christmas, but has hardly ever, if ever, started with two up front in his team regardless of results. And in games he tends to try and tweak it by moving from a back four to a back three, but not with vast tactical changes further forward. And the style of play is always the same. They rely so much on width, they rely so much on possession and dominance. But I've said before, and we saw this again at Hull on Saturday, I think they're at the most dangerous and at the most likely to score when they play on the counter-attack, because they have huge amounts of pace and they're very good with one-touch passing and quick distribution. And I think that is when teams really struggle to contain them, when the transitional play takes them from position in their own half to the edge of the opposition box in a flash. And you can think of countless games where you've seen Leeds dominate the ball, hog possession, but have been up against defences and teams who do stick with 10 players behind the ball, 11 players behind the ball, and you find that you have Harrison and you have Costa who are trying to cross into congested boxes, who are not really able to pick anybody out and are not able to make much of the ball that they have. And I think because there isn't any deviation from the standard tactics, when it works it looks great, when it doesn't work it looks a bit laboured and it looks a bit predictable. And I think in January when the results did turn for the worse, it looked a bit telegraphed and not pedestrian, but it looked as if it wasn't particularly difficult for sides to work out. And I think as well, teams in the Championship started to realise that Leeds were struggling mentally, they were lacking a bit of confidence. And I do think the division enjoyed the shift from Leeds bullying everybody else to everybody bullying Leeds.
At the back of your mind, do you have this worry that potentially that we could see the same thing happening this season that happened last season, or is that really gone for you now?
It could, but again, I think last season you always felt that Norwich were very much on a par with Leeds, and you never felt that you'd shaken off Sheffield United. There was always that threat from those two, and because it is only two positions for automatic promotion, if it is a three-horse race, you're always at risk of dropping out. I think we've got the game at home to Fulham coming up, which is going to be crucial. They, to me, are the only side that I can really see mounting a challenge now to the top two. So I'd like to say not, but it is going to get tense at some stage, and inevitably we'll get back to the point where everybody starts to realise that this could be the end of 15 years of fairly abject football, with the exception of Bielsa's spell and a couple of little periods, and 15 years of a fairly abject misery as well. There hasn't been a lot to cling to in this period, and that, like I say, is why the pressure always comes on so significantly at Leeds. I think it's a reason why they're not very good in the playoffs, because they are always the side that have this focus on them because of how long they have been out of the Premier League. So you'd like to think not, and you would like to think that last season will help the players who've been involved, but I don't doubt that there will be in the next 2 months periods where the tension kicks in again.
So that's the next 3 months for Leeds United. But what do they look like for Marcelo Bielsa? From where we're sitting, there's 10 games left in the Championship this season. I don't think we need to talk about how, you've already mentioned it, how impactful it's going to be on Leeds United's history. But I'm interested in your thoughts on how important this next 2 months is on Marcelo Bielsa's legacy. How do you think that he will be remembered on the basis of the next 2 months?
It's been so long outside of the Premier League, and there have been so many managers who've had a go, and ultimately I don't think there'd be a more romantic story than somebody like Bielsa doing it. And you almost feel that if somebody is going to do it, and if this is the point at which the kind of ceiling finally breaks, it'll be better for the fact that it's him, that it's somebody as kind of iconic and as influential in a coaching sense as Bielsa, rather than, to be quite honest, the feeling that they've spent their way out of it, or they've just amassed a really expensive squad who couldn't fail and would have got up under any coach. You genuinely feel that this would be Bielsa's triumph and his achievement, because it has in a huge, no small part at all, been down to him.
You're in the unique position of dealing with him on a regular basis. Obviously, there's a lot of narratives that are spun about Marcelo Bielsa as an individual. I wondered how your experiences of having to cover him on a regular basis have squared up to those narratives that you hear from people who aren't perhaps following Leeds United as closely as you are.
The crazy element of him I've never seen, really. I think the El Loco nickname was more than anything down to the way he played football, the way he got his teams to play, the kind of, not reckless, but the sort of strange formations, the 3-3-1-3, the systems that people hadn't seen before, and the kind of total commitment to possession and attacking. There are elements of him, if you look back, that look crazy in a personality sense, and he's had flashpoints and he's had run-ins with clubs and everything else, but actually he would seem to me, in his own kind of unique and sometimes strange way, to be the most considered coach I've dealt with, and also the coach with the most clarity about what he wants to do and how he sees his team setting up and games to be played. He is a coach that doesn't suffer stupid questions. He is a coach that will give you some fascinating insight into things that you never really expected to speak about. And also, I like the fact that he is a coach who will speak about tactics, who actually likes to get into the analysis of the tactical side of football. You see a lot of managers who talk about not liking the sort of tittle-tattle questions that come with football, particularly in the Premier League. But actually, when you try to nail them down to why did you play this player or why did you use this system, the number of managers who say systems are irrelevant, well, they're not irrelevant to Bielsa at all. Systems are fundamental to what he does, and he will talk at great length about why he does things to try and help you and, by extension, the supporters understand the point of his approach and his system. And I've really enjoyed that about him. And he can be difficult and he can be tetchy, and there are points at which you feel like he's going to jump across the table and punch you. But again, I like that, and I like the kind of spirit in him, and that it matters to him, that it's important. And above all else, he's able to do it without, certainly in public, letting his ego get in the way. He doesn't make it about him. He doesn't try to make it about him. I find it hard to believe that he is able to, in his head, is able to separate his own involvement from the actual results. I mean, I've said before that at the end of the season, I can imagine him crediting the players and trying to take very little credit himself, when in actual fact, a huge amount of it will be due to him. And he must understand the difference he makes and the influence he has. But it's all about the football for him. I think the things he enjoys most are sticking to one approach and the challenge of making it work, but also seeing the development of players, and young players in particular. But I think the progress of Cleek and the progress of Cooper, guys like that, it'll give him immense satisfaction, because that ultimately is what coaching is about. It is pure coaching, and I can safely say that we'll never deal with anybody like him again at Leeds.
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned the El Loco nickname, because it's a nickname that he, throughout his career, has always been a little bit tetchy about. I've heard a lot of press match interviews with him where he's refused to even say the nickname. He will say, you have this nickname for me, and he'll sort of talk about it in a roundabout way. I wondered, from what you know about him, why he might be so keen to distance himself from being talked about in the semantics of madness in particular, because that seems to be the thing that he is pushing back against. He doesn't like people considering his ideas to be crazy, because I think he believes in them and thinks they're good ideas.
Yeah, he doesn't think that they're crazy, and I think he wants people to realise that from his point of view, it is all done with rational thought. I mean, it's not unfair to say that it is all obsessional as well, and he goes to the nth degree in the way that a lot of managers don't. But again, I think he resents the idea that in some way he's trying to attract attract attention by what he does. I think he resents the idea that his craziness, or the craziness that people perceive in him, is attention seeking, or is done for the benefit of the cameras, or done for the benefit of the media, or more to the point, is done for the benefit of his profile and creating this caricature of somebody who is a bit off the wall and is a bit mental, to be frank. And it really isn't the case with him. I think more often than not, when he's come to blows with certain clubs, and I'd exclude Leo from this because that seemed to go wrong very quickly, and I think there were clearly issues there. But when it's gone wrong with clubs, it's because of standards or expectations. You know, at Lazio, they weren't delivering on transfers, so he left after 2 days. At Marseille, they couldn't agree on the terms of a contract, so again he went. And at Bilbao, there'd been arguments about the training ground, there'd been issues there. I think it's fair to say that was coming to the end of its lifespan anyway. I mean, it did feel as if it had all gone a little bit sour. But you know, somebody I know who knows him well had said to me, these situations don't develop because Bielsa is unduly difficult. I mean, he is difficult and he is demanding, but it's not because he's being unreasonable. It's happening because the clubs know what he expects, they know what he's going to demand, they know what he's like, and ultimately, if they don't operate in a way that he's happy with, he will up sticks and leave.
How much of this do you think comes down to personality? Because he's someone who you cannot experience for any amount of time without realising that he's not neurotypical. He clearly engages in the world in a way that's different to other people. How do you think that that's impacted the way that he's gone through management, how he's dealt with people as well?
I always imagine that it must be a challenge for him, being as kind of socially awkward as he is, in a sport where people expect footballers and managers to be very outgoing, to be very charismatic, and to give them lines, to give them stories to write about. He does that, but he does it in an almost unintentional way. So when you're getting stories from him about why he and Hernan Crespo fell out, he's not trying to fill your pages for you, and he's not trying to write headlines. He's just saying what is in his head, and he's trying to articulate other things. I mean, but the example with Crespo was that he felt with Crespo that he, at one point in his career, he'd had to lie to him about how good he was in order to get a better performance out of him. And so the kind of train of thought went that if you say things to players that aren't true, ultimately it's going to catch up with you, and you're going to get found out, because somewhere down the line they'll see that you contradict yourself, and ultimately their respect for you drops. His way of management is totally unique, and his style of dealing with the press is totally unique, and you're never going to get from Bielsa any show for the camera, any display of emotion that's made for the camera. And actually, you know, I always think back to Newell's Old Boys, where they won the first title, and there are the famous pictures of him on somebody's shoulders swinging the shirt around his head and the helicopter in the background. And it was different when he won the title at Villa Sarsfield, and it will, I'm sure, be different if Leeds get promoted. I don't see him making a great play to the crowd. I think it will be on the insistence of others if he does actually come out and acknowledge the crowd in any big way. And I think he will try to fade into the background and to make as little of it as possible, and in effect to try and leave it to others, because he doesn't seem to enjoy being the centre of attention. And I think in the main it's always been that way for him, and it's probably more and more the case as he gets older.
Which possibility do you think is more fitting for Bielsa's career? Is it the final triumph of promotion that sort of caps off a career that's been constantly seen through the lens of failure? Or is it the failure of another missed success that's dogged him throughout his footballing life?
If there's any romance in the game, you would have to think that it would be the former, and it would be that this coach who Leeds have thrown millions of pounds at and who've kind of sought out in the wilds of Argentina, you know, what looked like a totally unrealistic appointment when they first started talking about it, but ultimately came to pass. Him winning promotion here, I think, would be a very fitting end, and I've often wondered whether or not there's another job for him in football anywhere. Only he can say, and it might well be that he's someone who can't leave the game alone, but you know, he is into his mid-60s now, and I wonder what else would be out there for him if he wasn't at Leeds. I don't see him ever taking charge of another English club, and you know, there's constant interest in him from Spain and elsewhere, but it would surely have to be something that really appealed to him, and something that kind of had the same sort of passion for him as Newell's or as Leeds United. You're right. I mean, if it was to end in failure, it would extend the kind of narrative as there has been around him all the way through, and he knows that himself. But as I say, if football is romantic, and if there is any romance left in it, then it would be a bit of a travesty if he wasn't able to go out of here saying that he was the one after 15 years who finally broke this jinx.
You can read all of Phil Hay's coverage of Leeds United at The Athletic, or listen to it on the Phil Hay Show podcast. This episode was produced by Josh Schneider-Weiler and Hugo Chambray. I'm John Mackenzie. Thanks for listening to Football Today. If you like this podcast, why not rate and review it on iTunes, or share an episode with a friend. See you next time.